The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is out, and it's become a huge hit. We looked at it just prior to launch, but there is some unfinished business to discuss. But to do that, I wanted to bring on a special guest, Modern Vintage Gamer.
What's going on, John? It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show. As always, it's a pleasure to be here.
You did some awesome testing for this game with overclocking, and that's something we're going to discuss today, but that's just one of 5 major themes of this video. So let me run down some of the things we're going to talk about today, starting with pre-patch performance. Upon release, I picked up a physical copy of the game so that we could test the game without the original patch. I mentioned this in my first video, but now we can actually put some numbers to it and see how it differs. We're also going to check out the variance between different models of Switch. I tested this on my 2017 Switch, as well as a 2019 LCD Mariko Switch and the Switch OLED, and I did find some slight differences, which we'll discuss today. Then we're going to get to the overclocking section, where we discuss the results that you uncovered with your modded Switch, which showcase the game running basically perfectly with the right settings, which is very interesting stuff, followed by portable performance analysis, so we can put some actual numbers to that, and then we'll briefly touch on the latest patch which just dropped. So let's get into it. So the very first thing to talk about here is the unpatched version of the game, and I understand most players won't be experiencing this, right? But it's still interesting to see the way Nintendo shipped this game initially. And also, this is the review build I played for a week before the patch rolled out. And it does generally match my original experience. The game basically chugs more often, just as I suspected. So one test that actually shows this in action here is this town square. You know, after you jump off the ruins and you end up down here where that initial tower is, just running around the square facing the center here, I noticed that, yeah, it does drop significantly more pre-patch, and yeah, it's bad. And we'll touch on why I think it drops so much more when we talk about the variance and systems. But did you get a chance to play it pre-patch?
Yeah, I actually did. So I knew that the physical version of the game had the 1.0 version, not the kind of the 1.1 version, which was the day one patch. So I did play with the 1.0 version, I want to say for about an hour or so before I moved on to the 1.1 version. But one of the things I noticed was that you're exactly right with your findings, and that was it just really gets a lot choppier more often for no real apparent reason. There's obviously issues with, turning on Ultra Hand and stuff, which we're going to talk about. But this particular version, I think it was just, I don't know, for whatever reason, it just really would drop its frames at random, seemingly. And one great example, one great test that I did, I remember when I was jumping out of the sky off the Great Sky Island onto the world of Hyrule. There was a notable pause for maybe about a second before everything just kind of stopped, and then it kind of jumped back to life again. And for a hot minute there, John, it felt like the game had just locked up completely, and that was very surprising to see that, because Tears of the Kingdom, at least in my experience, has not crashed once. So I was a little nervous that the game had crashed, but then it kind of corrected itself and it went back on its merry way. But those types of dead stutters really were very apparent with the pre-patch version, we'll say it, the 1.0 version that you get on the cartridge.
Indeed, but thankfully most people won't actually be playing this version, and the performance data here is really just academic.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully, just for preservation's sake, I'd like hopefully they'll do a Game of the Year edition or something that has everything like bundled with it, and the latest patch as well, because that would be really cool to have that on a physical cartridge, of course.
Thankfully, Nintendo does actually have a great track record with that, and most of the releases do receive the patches on cart, so I suspect within a year we'll have patched up versions of this game on the shelves. It does kind of suck for us initial owners, but still, it's good that it's there. But
definitely,
the other thing I tested that I thought was really unusual is I had heard some talk about, the game runs a little bit worse in my Switch versus what we saw in the video, and what's going on there. So I actually loaded it up on my 3 different Switches, the 2017, the 2019 Mariko, and the OLED Switch. And, as other users had uncovered, I actually did find some difference there. The test I used is this initial section, right, when you dive off the platform right at the beginning of the game. On my 2017 Switch, no matter what, I always got this stutter right here. Or more like it's just a brief dip to 20 frames per second. And this is basically a scripted scene at this point, right? So that little variance between this system and the newer systems suggests that there are going to be other areas that will also exhibit performance differences between the two. And really, the main difference here comes down to the memory latency between the two models, which is slightly lower on the Mariko Switch versus the older one. The actual clocks, though, are the same between the two.
In some cases, having hardware that is a revision of kind of the original hardware, we've seen this happen with the Xbox One S over the original VCR with some games which have a little bit better performance overall. I think Project Cars was the game that it comes to mind when I think about how the Xbox One S kind of had a little bit better performance than the VCR version, although technically they are one and the same. They should be the same kind of hardware specs and everything. So I would say that the Mariko revision is doing something similar to that, where it's technically the same as far as its base clocks and its GPU and memory clocks, but maybe it's just a little bit higher. It's not really something that is a big concern or a big deal, but it just gives some games some extra performance along the way, which is kind of cool, actually.
So my theory on this relates to the fact that the game uses a double buffer VSync setup, as we mentioned in the original video. Basically, to hit 30 frames per second, it's got to be 33 milliseconds roughly per frame, right? But with the slightly lower memory clocks, I guess, if that frame were to slip just below, or I guess just above 33 milliseconds, let's say it takes 34 milliseconds to render a frame, it's actually going to crash down to 20 frames per second until it reaches 33 milliseconds again, right? So if both switches are just riding that line, and then the older one just happens to fall just a little bit above that line, it's going to hit 20, and that's why you're going to get more slowdown on the older model. At least that's my guess.
Absolutely.
I don't know. Does that sound
that
reasonable?
Makes total sense to me, John? And I think like we said, it just seems like although both SoC chipsets are very, very similar to each other, they're not identical, and those slight differences can make the difference in the end, which is kind of cool.
Absolutely. But regardless of which Switch model you are using, there is actually a method for improving performance, and this is something you showcased in a video on your channel, and one of the reasons I wanted to ask you here to discuss it. Basically, you can overclock the Switch, but while you might expect, like, oh, you've overclocked the CPU or GPU, you actually found that it's memory speed that has the greatest influence on the game. So could you discuss your experiences and findings with that for us?
For sure. So with Tears of the Kingdom, it's a very, very interesting game to kind of benchmark and throw overclocking at. So the way that I kind of approached this, John, was I'm very kind of meticulous when it comes to these types of tests. So I always want to determine where the bottleneck lies, because in some cases with Switch games that I've kind of run overclocking tests over the years, there's either a memory bandwidth limitation or a limitation with the GPU or the CPU, right? So trying to identify which one is the bottleneck is always interesting to see, because different games kind of respond differently. So with Tears of the Kingdom, I kind of felt like it was going to be a similar type of limitation to Breath of the Wild, which had the majority of the limitation in a game like Breath of the Wild was in its memory bandwidth. But in order to kind of run all these tests, I kind of kept it pretty simple. So the first test that I ran was I overclocked my modded V1 base model Switch to 1.7 gigahertz. So that's a 700 megahertz kind of improvement over the base clocks, roughly 700 megahertz. And I kept the GPU and the memory clocks as stock, right? And the test that I ran was in Kakariko Village, which is kind of the the big one for testing performance. And I found that with a 1.7 gigahertz CPU overclock, there was really no difference at all in performance. There may have been the occasional smoothing out of a frame here or there, depending on, if there was some physics processing that was going on, potentially with Ultrahand. But look, the gains that I saw were mostly negligible. So it kind of told me off the bat that this is not a game that is CPU bound in any stretch of the imagination. So then the next test was to set the CPU overclocks, or the CPU clocks, back to stock 1 gigahertz, but boost the GPU clock to 921 megahertz, which is roughly from 768, what are we looking at, about 100 and something odd increase, or 200 and something odd megahertz increase in clocks there. And with a GPU overclock, it definitely fared better, but it still wasn't perfect. You can still see that when you kind of run around in Kakariko Village, especially when you start kind of turning Ultra Hand on, you're still dropping frames. It's still getting to that 20 frames per second kind of, that floor, right? But it did help in some scenarios, especially when it came to some post-processing and things like that.
Indeed.
But the main one that really helps Tears of the Kingdom, and the third test that I ran, was to set everything back to stock. So CPU and GPU are back to stock clocks, but we're increasing the memory clocks from 1.6 gigahertz to about 1.86 gigahertz. So, a 260 odd megahertz increase in memory clocks. And as you can see here, it has smoothed out performance quite considerably. It's definitely not perfect. There's still some spots where when you do press Ultra Hand, it'll just drop a few frames, and then it'll quickly just kind of fix itself. But it almost seems like it's a scenario where after a while it doesn't really make a difference. It just kind of locks it at 30 frames per second. So memory bandwidth has always been kind of the underlying bottleneck of a game like Tears of the Kingdom. And I also did another couple of tests where I kind of maxed everything out. I just kind of went full tilt on the CPU, GPU, and memory clocks, and that was getting a rock solid 30. There was nothing I could do to get it off of 30 frames per second at all. And the last test that I did was just kind of find the sweet spot, if you will, of what's the best kind of CPU, GPU, and memory clock settings. And I kind of settled for a 1.2 gigahertz CPU, which is a very, very moderate overclock, a 200 megahertz overclock. The GPU was clocked to 844, which is, again, not really that much more than the 768 that we're used to from the base specs. And then the same 1.8 gigahertz, and this for the memory clocks. And this really gave us the sweet spot. It didn't miss a beat, no drop frames, and really, I think a really good scenario and test of what the Switch can do if you just push it a little more. So the main kind of result of this was increasing those memory clocks is going to go a long way to increase performance on a game like Tears of the Kingdom.
That's interesting stuff indeed, and it looks like it's very feasible to get an improved experience with just a few tweaks, if you have a hacked Switch, of course. But yep. I'm also very curious about what's possible with the Mariko Switch that's been overclocked, since it seems like there's a lot more potential to push all the clocks up to reach higher levels of performance. And you even mentioned that someone in the community has unlocked the frame rate, and that it might be possible to reach 60 frames per second on the Switch, on a Mariko Switch that's been fully overclocked.
That is correct. I've seen some pretty wild Mariko memory overclocking. I'm seeing even up to as high as 2.8 gigahertz on the memory clocks, and with an uncapped frame rate patch, all of a sudden it's possible to hit that 60 FPS mark.
Well, that would be nice, but we still kind of need to test that to see if it's really possible to get to 60. Maybe in select circumstances, hard to say. Have you been able to test this yourself?
I personally don't have a Mariko Switch, John, unfortunately, or one that I can overclock. But I'd love to get my hands on one and run some tests on, because I think that'd be really cool to take a look at.
Kind of reminds me of that untapped potential that you would see in, like, say, the new 3DS, right? Where original 3DS games are normally capped at the original clock speeds of the launch 3DS, but you can unleash it with homebrew, and it reveals that it solves many problems, many performance issues in 3DS games. And it seems like that's kind of the case here as well, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, the overclocking stuff is very interesting because, like you said, it really does benefit the homebrew community. It also is a bit of a taste. I'll say a very, very small taste of what potentially could come on new Nintendo hardware at some point, right? We obviously know that, it's not just going to be about memory bandwidth that gets improved, but if we can start to see some of these games that are 30 frames per second experiences jump up and look better or run better performing, then all of a sudden we're getting a little glimpse of potentially what we could see going forward with new Nintendo hardware, and that's very interesting to me.
Indeed, but of course this is a portable machine first and foremost, I would argue, and with the release build of the game, I could finally test it in portable mode using our portable capture switch. With the way the review process works, this was not possible for the original video, but now we can take a look at it, and this is running on a stock, well, other than the portable output mod, this is a stock 2017 Switch with no overclocking or anything like that. And first is the resolution numbers. Even in portable mode, you can see that it does drop resolution, dynamic resolution scaling, just like in docked mode. But now we can put numbers to it. And those numbers are 540p as the floor, up to 720p. And unlike docked, though, it does actually seem to stick to 720p more often than I expected, so the actual image quality is surprisingly sharp. And honestly, I think the game looks phenomenal in handheld mode, especially on an OLED model. It's just extremely vibrant, sharp, and crisp, which is great. But then I also decided to benchmark it and run some performance tests, and I found that performance is interesting. So pre-patch, it seemed even worse than docked performance in pre-patch mode, right? You're just running around, nothing's happening on screen, you just turn the camera in specific directions and you just drop frames. And it's not clear why that's happening, but it definitely happens. But once you patch it up, everything seems pretty good, solid, similar to docked, possibly even better. And I do think that this is a great way to experience the game. And it just reminds me again how good the Switch OLED screen can be.
Oh yeah, beautiful.
Right? Like, it's so much better than, say, the Steam Deck is out there. The Steam Deck is much more powerful than the Switch, but the screen, it's not very good.
It's vastly inferior, in my opinion, to the OLED panel.
Exactly. And so that does have an impact on experience, I've found.
Yeah.
But it was nice to finally see that for myself. And yeah, what you're watching here is direct feed capture of the Switch in portable mode, which is pretty cool. But then lastly, as you probably saw, just before we recorded this, Nintendo dropped a new patch for Tears of the Kingdom. And there was a lot of discussion instantly around it about, wait, did they improve performance again? What is the difference? So I immediately ran to Kakariko Village and all the various hotspots to test, and unfortunately, at least in these cases, I did not find that performance improved much at all. It was largely similar, with the same drops to 20 frames per second, especially when you bring out the Ultra Hand or just paraglide over the village. It really starts to tank, as it always does. So if there was an improvement, it's very, very subtle, and I don't think that it would vastly improve the experience for most users, suggesting that Nintendo has kind of reached the limit of what's possible performance-wise with this game.
I would agree with that, John. I think this game is pushing the Switch. I think there's that narrative that, is the game too much for the Switch, or is it too big for the Switch?
Too big, yeah.
I don't think it is, but I think it's really pushing it pretty hard, right? I would be surprised if we got any more performance updates going forward. We may get the occasional chipping away at some smaller things, some smaller kind of edge case scenarios potentially that could assist. But I think they've already done the heavy lifting with that 1.1 patch, which was something I think they've probably had in their back pocket for a while, where they kind of had it ready for day one, to go live. And I think that's probably one of the best performance updates I've seen in quite some time with any game, to be completely honest with you. So, but look, I mean, I've never really felt like I had a handle on what Nintendo does with their development. So they seem like they make magic happen sometimes. So potentially we could see more performance updates coming with this game. I just don't feel like they'll have the magnitude of the 1.1 patch. I feel like it'll be kind of smaller bite-sized edge cases that potentially get addressed. So
yeah,
but we'll see. We'll have to keep an eye on the trajectory of the game and the patches that come out subsequently, and whether they continue to look at performance, because I think you're right. I think they're pushing this one pretty hard.
And I think it's just the game itself is extremely emergent in terms of gameplay. And I think different users are going to have different experiences based on how they use the powers, where they use them, and what they do within the game. And because of that double buffer VSync, if let's say it were triple buffered, I'd imagine in most of these cases it would just be dropping to like 29, 28 frames per second. Not a huge hit, but clearly they selected double buffering for a reason, probably a combination of memory and also maybe for response purposes, because you do save a frame on input latency when you double buffer. So many people have commented that this game feels more responsive than your typical 30 frames per second game, and that's part of the reason why, though certainly not the entire reason, I'd imagine. But yeah, so I feel like that's a pretty good look at this game, sort of a round two. And yeah, I have definitely found that the more you play the game and the further you get, there are definitely situations that push the switch even harder, and you're getting those frame drops. So it's not perfect in that regard by any stretch of the imagination, but at least what they did ship is exceptionally bug-free, which is honestly shocking given the amount of freedom the developers allow. It's almost as if they're taunting you to break the game, and yet it does not break. And I can't even begin to imagine what the testing process must have looked like for this title. It's really remarkable stuff, and I'm really happy with the end result.
Absolutely agree. And this game took a long time to develop, and I think a lot of that time was taken up by QA testing. Just thousands upon thousands of hours just to ensure that this amazing sandbox that has been created just works the way you expect it to. And it's an absolute masterpiece of a game. And look, I still mess around with all the Zonai little gadgets and stuff, and just build kind of various things. And I'm still blown away by the chain physics that are in the game, and just the fact that there's a massive world to explore, and all these kind of systems are running at the same time. Not only that, you've still got a really good game that performs very, very well. 97% of the time, it's running at 30 frames per second without any issue whatsoever, all on a handheld device that is based around old hardware from 2015. It's an absolute marvel of a game, and I absolutely love it. I'm still playing it, and I'm probably going to keep playing it for the next couple of months, because I'm absolutely hooked on it.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that's going to do it for this video. So I do want to thank you for joining us, and why don't you let everybody know where they can find you?
It's always a pleasure being on DF, John. So thanks for having me. You can find me on YouTube at Modern Vintage Gamer. I do at least one video a week, usually on a Monday. So check out the channel if you haven't already. And thanks for having me.
Of course. And yeah, if you are a fan of Digital Foundry stuff, I definitely recommend checking out MVG as well. He puts out great content. So thanks for all that, of course, and thanks for being here. And thank you for watching this episode, and we'll see you next time.